Okay, guys, welcome. We're gonna get started. Sorry for the technical difficulties. Um, my name's Erin Lindley. I am the chair for the Utah Women's Soccer Network, and we are more than thrilled to have these amazing women do this panel for us today on coaching the female athlete. I've seen their slides, I've seen information, and it is phenomenal. So you guys are seriously in for a treat. I'm really excited. Um, so our first speaker will be Brooke Kudelka. She received her master's degree in nutrition from the University of Utah. And as a former UISA soccer player, she loves working with our teams and athletes. Brooke has experience working with a variety of athletes, including professional, collegiate, youth, and weekend warriors. She is passionate about helping athletes improve their nutrition for maximum performance and return to play after injury.
Thank you. I am so excited to be talking to you specifically about nutrition and how it's important for the female athlete and how it's different from a male athlete. So quickly, we're going to review the basics of the menstrual cycle and the hormones involved and how those hormones impact performance associated with specific fuel utilization and the nutrients that we consume. And also, how can we adapt that to optimize training and performance, of course. So here is our basic menstrual cycle and the most popular hormones involved. It's a little bit hard to see up here, but what we're going to focus on today are the two specific larger phases of the menstrual cycle. So the first half is our follicular phase, which also includes menstruation. And then the second half is the luteal phase of the menstrual cycle. And what you can see here are the change in hormones and how they increase or decrease in specific phases of the cycle. And this is important because hormones control the body processing, signaling, and specifically how our body utilizes specific nutrients. So we'll get into that. We're going to focus mostly on progesterone and estrogen, which are the yellow and orange in here, which is a little bit harder to see. But of note, they're lowest in the first half of the menstrual cycle, and they are increased in the second half of the menstrual cycle. And we'll talk about why that is important. So to note, both in the follicular phase and the luteal phase, our body's doing pretty much opposite things with nutrients. So in our follicular phase, which is the first half of the cycle, so day 1 of bleeding through day 14 on average of our cycle. So we see here in the follicular phase, we have less fat oxidation and protein oxidation, which means we are not prioritizing fat or proteins for energy. We are prioritizing carbohydrates for energy during this phase. I also want to say our brain and our muscles prefer carbohydrates for energy, which is really important as an athlete. Okay, so during this phase, that is what also our body is prioritizing for energy. You also see decreased glycogen storage, which is our storage form of carbohydrates, because we have an increased efficacy of compensating for low carbs in the body, or our body's really efficient at utilizing them. And then we see the opposite in the second half of our cycle. So in our luteal phase, when our hormones are higher, we have an increased prioritization for utilizing fat for energy and protein for energy, which will come into play a little bit later when we talk about symptoms. And so our carbohydrate oxidation is lower. Even though that's our brain and our muscles' preferred energy source, our body is not utilizing it as efficiently during this phase. Also, we're going to talk about this more. Our luteal phase, we have a little bit of an increased energy expenditure, which means our metabolism is increased a little bit during this phase, which requires more calories and more energy. And it does the opposite. We have increased glycogen storage because we have less efficiency of utilizing carbs during this stage. I also do want to say the follicular phase, or first half of our cycle, is when women are most similar to males in how they utilize nutrients, which is important because most research is done from males. Most nutrition research is done through males. Okay, so more about our follicular phase. Again, first half of the cycle, including menstruation. This is considered our lower hormone phase. And what we've found is that we have a higher pain threshold, which causes a lower rate of perceived exertion, lower RPEs, which I'm sure these ladies are going to talk about. But this is more appropriate for high intensity work. Like I said, we have a greater utilization of carbohydrates, which allows for more energy availability so that we can have harder and higher training intensity. So typically during this time, I would say majority of women will feel stronger, better, faster endurance, or longer endurance, all of those things. I do want to note that when I was in high school playing soccer, I actually looked forward to being on my period because I noticed that I always played so well. And it wasn't until I became a dietitian and did this research, I was like, well, that makes so much sense because this is when our hormones are at the lowest and we typically will likely see better performance. Compared to our luteal phase, the second half of the cycle, where we have increased fat and protein oxidation for our energy, we do see that estrogen promotes this fat utilization and decreases our liver glucose production because our liver does produce carbs to give us energy. So we have less of that available. So we're utilizing fats more, which is still great, but it's a little bit slower in producing energy for our bodies. And so we found that high intensity work is less supported in the fact that it's that we aren't as able to perform at a high intensity. Also, I know that Erin's going to talk more about this, but we do have an increased risk for injury during this luteal phase, specifically because we have a little bit of ligament laxity because of the hormone relaxin is increased. Relaxin allows for more stretch in our ligaments and tendons. This hormone relaxin is also the same one that is increased in pregnant women to allow for their bodies to stretch for when they're pregnant. It's not increased as much as when we're pregnant, but a little bit during this phase. We also see impaired coordination and concentration, and then some of these PMS symptoms that can contribute to decreased performance, and we're going to talk more about that. And then in this phase, which is also really important to note, is there is a greater risk for dehydration and heat stress because we have an increased core body temperature. I do have another slide showing this, but the body temperature in this phase goes up about 1 to 1.5 degrees, which might not seem super significant, but it is enough to contribute to increased risk of dehydration. Also, sweating is delayed, so that's going to also cause issues with core body temperature. And then due to the increased progesterone, we have a greater amounts of sodium loss in our sweat, which is also important to replace, especially if we're low in sodium in our body, it can cause a decrease in performance. So general recommendations for this phase is to scale back intensity if possible and focus on technique. Okay, so specific training and fueling considerations in our follicular phase, so in the first half of our cycle. So carbohydrates around training are more important. So our body is utilizing them really, really efficiently and burning them up really fast. We want to make sure that our female athletes are having a good amount of carbs before practice or especially before a game, okay? Because that's what our body is wanting to use for energy. So we need to make sure that we're providing those in the diet. I'll answer questions at the end. Okay. Yes, we also have an increased storage capacity. So that's also why fueling with carbs before is going to be really, really important. And because of that, we don't need as many carbs during training. I still always will recommend at halftime, or if you have a long practice, to have a break, to have some sort of carbs, even if it's in the form of a sports drink or a small snack. Really, really important. Also during this phase, I do want to say our body is more efficient at maintaining our blood sugar compared to in the luteal phase. Okay, so continuing follicular phase, our calorie needs aren't quite as high as they are in the luteal phase. We don't have that increase in metabolism. Also, I should have mentioned this earlier. Often we see when women, or we hear it often, when women are on their period, like I am always craving carbs. And that would make sense because our body is utilizing them a lot more efficiently, and that's the priority. So if a girl is craving carbs when she's on her period, we need to provide those. Ideally in the most healthy form, right? We don't want it just to be donuts or anything, but it's still important that we are utilizing carbs in that phase. Okay, also, I want to make sure we are optimizing muscle repair, because if we are able to push harder and train longer at a higher intensity, we are probably having more muscle damage and muscle breakdowns. We want to make sure we're also providing appropriate amounts of protein for that muscle repair. So our general recommendation is 1.6 grams per kilogram of protein per day. And then making sure we have a good quality source of protein after, with around 20 to 30 grams after training or after a game. Because this is where we consider our muscle strength or muscle building phase. Okay, so in our luteal phase, like I mentioned, in our second half of our cycle, we do have an increase in our metabolism, in our calorie needs, anywhere from a 2.5 to an 11% increase, which might not seem super significant, but I think it is absolutely relevant. So we might see some more cravings, or definitely an increase in calorie intake, probably a little bit of an increase in appetite. As we can see on the right side of the screen, this is showing the increase in body temperature, which contributes to that increase in metabolism. So it increases about 1 degree to 1.5 degrees, which I know the Oura Ring can measure this and kind of tell you like, oh, your temperature increased, you're probably in this phase of your cycle. We do have greater amino acid oxidation, right? Because we're utilizing a little bit of protein for energy. So we want to increase our protein intake during this stage, 10 to 12% of what you, of the recommendation at 1.6 grams per kilogram. So we want to increase that. Also, protein is important to help promote satiety. And then absolutely paying attention to hydration. I would prioritize hydration during this phase, making sure we're getting enough, increasing our sodium intake a little bit, maybe utilizing some electrolyte drinks would be a good idea. And then if you are playing in the summer or in a hot area, if you're going to a tournament of somewhere that has a hotter temperature, making sure we have cold fluids, maybe cold towels to make sure their body temperature stays lower so we don't have risk for that heat exhaustion. Okay, we also want to increase carbohydrates around training, because our body's not utilizing them as efficiently, even though our brain and our muscles are preferring it. So we're going to increase our carbs right before and during, so that we still have them available. We also aren't as effective of doing any carb loading because of our storage signals are decreased. So making sure we're having them just available through food is going to be really important. And then if we know specific athletes struggle with PMS symptoms, recommending anti-inflammatory foods, also omega-3s, vitamin Ds, and phytonutrients are important. Also, here's some general recommendations. So PMS is premenstrual syndrome, typically happens about 5 to 7 days before the period starts. Okay, so if you have athletes that struggle with some of these symptoms, here are some nutrient recommendations that we have for all of them. So bloating, headache, and cramps, 7 days before their cycle. So it's going to be important for them to know their cycle and when they're generally going to start, because we have these recommendations to start every day, 7 days before their cycle, which includes omega-3s, magnesium, zinc, aspirin, and then focusing on reducing sugar intake, limiting sugar alcohols, which are like erythritol, xylitol, mannitol, And then increasing leucine. Leucine is an amino acid, really high like in whey protein and a lot of our animal products. And then headache, appetite cravings, brain fog, and sleep all have those nutrient recommendations. On the handout that hopefully you have in front of you has all of this information on it also. But this can be really important to help these athletes optimize their performance, especially like when you have important games and they are struggling with these symptoms. This might not make it go away, but it's gonna hopefully reduce the severity of it. Okay, let's talk about contraception briefly. So we're talking about the two most common types. First one is the pill, the oral contraceptive pill. On this, girls do not have a natural cycle. Those pills are giving them the synthetic hormones. So their body isn't producing them because they're getting them through the pill. So typically on the pill, it's 3 weeks of hormones, 3 weeks of the pill, and then 1 week of placebo, which is no hormones, to initiate their period, right? So it's a common treatment for heavy bleeding, PMS. I've seen it for acne. Sometimes if your athlete isn't having periods, the pill is really commonly prescribed. However, I wouldn't recommend it for an athlete, and we'll get into the why of that. And then we have the IUD, just on the right side. IUD has local progestin, and that's typically the only hormone in it, and it's in a much smaller amounts than the pill. And a girl will still have a natural cycle while on the IUD. I forgot to mention, on the pill, those pills have about 3 to 4 times the amount of hormones than a natural cycle. Okay, so really high hormone amount in those. Okay, so training with contraception. Like I said, in the IUD, a female will still have a normal cycle, and we have the same training and nutrition recommendations when they're on the IUD. On the pill, we have typically 3 weeks of high hormone and then 1 week of low hormone. So in the first half of the cycle, during their low hormone phase, they only have 1 week of that instead of 2. Okay. Here are some of the recommendations I know that they're going to talk about, but I do want to say, if you do have a girl that is still going to take the pill, it typically has a half-life of 12 hours. So we recommend taking the pill opposite of training. So if you train in the morning or have a game in the morning, take the pill in the evening, or the opposite as much as possible. And here are some possible effects that we found through research on the oral contraceptive pill. Potential decreased VO2 peak, decreased cardiac output, decreased aerobic capacity, not large, but still have found decreased aerobic capacity. Negatively affects bone formation, specifically because of the high estrogen levels. Estrogen helps control our bone formation. Also, our bones are forming and getting stronger up until about age 25 to 30. So really important that we are maximizing that. Can affect our glucose and lipid utilization, which we kind of talked about. Increased inflammation, higher risk for blood clotting, which can cause some serious issues. We found that overall an athlete who is on the pill has about a 6% decrease in performance compared to an athlete that has a natural cycle. Why that might not seem super large, I still think it's significant enough just by taking the pill that you wouldn't think would affect performance. Okay. Okay, I also think it's important that every girl should know her cycle. So I would encourage your athletes to download an app. I know that most phones now have like a health app that you can log it. If they don't want to do that, they can literally log it on a piece of paper or a journal or something like that. Here are some popular apps that are great. Also can send you notifications like, oh, your period's probably starting in the next week. And that might remind them to, okay, maybe I should start taking these supplements to help decrease PMS symptoms or anything like that. But I think it's important that every girl should know her cycle. And then this is part of the handout that I have for you. It splits the period into, splits our cycle into different periods, and the best way to adapt your nutrition, adapt training. Also talks about symptoms you might experience and what to do with that. Okay, I'm not going to go all the way through this because we started a little bit late, but I think it's a really good starting point and a way for you guys to help your athletes, and you can also hand that out to your athletes. I also want to say I am available through Utah Youth Soccer for free team talks to come and talk to your teams about nutrition. I typically talk about all general sports nutrition. I can also talk about specific female nutrition or whatever you want. So please contact me if that's something you're interested in. And thank you so much for your time.
So I forgot to mention this at the beginning. That was totally my fault. But here, I'll move out of the way so you can take a picture. At the end, we'll have a panel. These women will be up here and you can ask any questions. So write down any questions that you have and you can ask